Aloha and good morning from beautiful Wahiawa, Hawaii. PV here. Welcome to chapel. This morning I woke up to write my chapel message like I normally do, and I have to admit that it was pretty chilly here in Wahiawa. Now, before some of you start teasing me for getting cold while living in a state that has all of one season, I have lived in places with four seasons and below zero temperatures, and I usually am pretty impervious to the cold. But the temperature this morning just made it feel like sweater weather, or by sweater I mean sweatshirt, specifically the one that I'm wearing. It's just my old Navy sweatshirt. It's nothing fancy. It's certainly not expensive, but there's just something about it that just makes me feel comfortable. Well, what about you? What's an article of clothing that you wear that just makes you feel comfortable? Maybe it's an old t-shirt that just feels right, or maybe it's a pair of leggings that just makes you feel unstoppable. Whatever it is, I'd like to know. Teachers, go ahead and pause the video and ask your students. And for those of you watching this on YouTube, go ahead and let me know by leaving a comment. Now, I'm all for being comfortable, but what if our comfortability actually lulls us into complacency? We are obviously a Christian school, but what if by being exactly that, we are rendered ineffective because we equate being Christian with simply being a good person who is saved? What if we are not really accomplishing our objective because we live as if we are at peace when we are actually at war? War. That word can make people feel uncomfortable, especially in Christian circles where the tendency is towards nonviolence at best and pacifism at worst. And yes, I don't think pacifism is a wise position. Few positions on the extremes are. But the uncomfortable reality is that we are at war, a spiritual war. And as in all wars, without a clear objective, there cannot be a decisive victory. And without being able to clearly identify the enemy, there is a greater possibility for friendly fire casualties. Again, I do understand that war language might make some of you feel uncomfortable, but I ask you to stick with me as we spend the next several weeks looking at a particular passage in Ephesians that will help us to stand strong as soldiers for Christ. Now, Paul, after explaining the new identity that people have in Christ, closes his letter to the Ephesians by articulating several ways that this new identity is to be lived out. As he closes up his letter, he writes, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." This is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 12. Now, as previously mentioned, if you want to be successful in combat, whether it be against physical opponents, digital opponents like a video game, or spiritual opponents, you have to actually know who your opponents are. To be explicitly clear, Paul starts with who, as Christians, our opponents are not. In his words, they are not flesh and blood. In other words, they're not people. It is my view that you will never meet a person for whom Christ has not died. And if he saw fit to give himself for them, the very least you could do is not see them as an enemy. As Christians, people who are not Christians are not the enemy. They are people who have yet to be set free from the bondage of sin. And it is at this point that Paul and I turn to the actual enemies. Paul writes about the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And it is here that I may make some of you even more uncomfortable. The text itself, by exhorting believers to stand against the devil's schemes, suggests that these terms refer to spiritual enemies. But scholars, starting in Germany in the 1930s, began viewing passages like this as archaic relics of superstition, and instead interpret them in light of their own situation, attributing the identity of the powers to oppressive political and socioeconomic systems. I will return to this shortly, but I think C.S. Lewis put it best in his preface to the Screwtape Letters. He says, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves, the demons that is, are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. What I think we have here is a root and shoot issue. That is, it is not that these two positions are mutually exclusive, but that one is the root of the other. As theologian George Caird said, the real enemies are the spiritual forces that stand behind all institutions of government and control the lives of men and nations. Our enemies are spiritual, but they can manifest their evil through the use of institutional structures. As such, attacking the structures themselves will not sufficiently root out the problem. So what then are we to do? Well, the passage itself commands us to be strong in the Lord and put on the full armor of God. We will spend the next several chapels unpacking the latter, but for now I want to focus on the imperative to be strong. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know it from the English translation, but the gist of the Greek is to be continually strengthened in the Lord. This is not a one-time thing like, Captain America getting a shot of steroids, super serum, and then being perpetually jacked. Instead, it's a lifestyle, a regular communion with God through the Word and through prayer from which a Christian can draw his or her power. In contrast to a super serum, the command to be strong in the Lord is more like regularly working out. And it is from this metaphor that I want to encourage you. See, when I was in my late 20s, I was starting out as a husband, as a father, as a pastor, all at the same time. And my dad would encourage me to stay healthy and try to work out regularly. I would usually make an excuse about being too busy, but he would always say 10 minutes of something is better than 0 minutes of nothing. With that in mind, I want to encourage you to commit to just a bit of Bible reading and a bit of prayer each day. Maybe it's just a verse or two from the Proverbs, or maybe it's a chapter a day from one of the Gospels. 10 minutes of something is better than 0 minutes of nothing. And when you pray, maybe it's just a quick, Lord, help. Or maybe it's a recitation of the Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father, as it's also known. 10 minutes of something is better than 0 minutes of nothing. In closing, one of my favorite quotes is from the Greek poet Archilochus, who said, "We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training." Training for combat, whether spiritual or physical, is not comfortable. But if we take the small steps, if we approach our training with the attitude that 10 minutes of something is better than 0 minutes of nothing, then we will be prepared to stand and to continue to stand in the Lord against the spiritual enemies that would see humanity divided and destroyed. With that, may we stand strong. Aloha. Have a great day.